Your talks lasted 6 months and failed to reach agreement. This was a much shorter time period, of course, but are you surprised that agreement was not made in the time available?
The short answer is not terribly. In order for any agreement to be reached in any negotiation, beyond the details, you've got to have leadership that's willing and able to compromise and to sell those compromises back to their parties and their supporters. So here you've got differences over the substance, and you've got leadership that in some cases may not be fully able to sell compromises. So again, some of the same issues that have plagued Northern Ireland.
You have said there's no Martin McGuinness or Peter Robinson here today, but they were there when you were leading the talks, and their leadership didn't bring it across the line.
Fair enough. And I suppose you could blame the mediator there if you'd like, but I also think it shows the depth of difference over the issues. And I think in particular, I think for the DUP, it's been very hard to sell compromises to the rank and file, somewhat less difficult for Sinn Féin.
The parameters do shift, though. You talked about parades, flags and legacy. Today, it's the Irish language which has brought things to their knees. Yeah,
it's very interesting. As you say correctly, when I was involved in the talk on both occasions, first as the U.S. government envoy, then brought in by the parties in the executive, the Irish language issue was really a tertiary issue at most. It's interesting that it seems to have come to the fore here. And one of the questions I would have, are we really talking about the Irish language issue? It's not as though that many more people suddenly are fluent in the language. Or has this become something of a proxy for both sides about, in some ways, the relationship between the North and the Republic, the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK? And my own sense, sitting thousands of miles away, is that this has become something of a symbolic issue now.
It's seen, certainly by nationalists and Irish speakers, as what they call a respect issue. I mean, in your experience, was there a marked lack of respect between the two traditions when you were so deeply involved with them?
There was certainly a lack of empathy and a lack of a willingness to put yourself in the other person's shoes, or a tremendous sense of baggage from the past, of bitterness. It was very hard to get people not to recount all the slights and injustices as they perceive them from the past, and to put it bluntly, to get on with it.
Yeah, I mean, you were an independent chairman without success, sadly. There's been talk that any new talk should have, once again, an independent chair. Do you think that is the way to do it?
In my own experience, independent chairs, outside mediators, whatever you call him or her, they maybe provide the last 5% of a negotiation, but the lion's share of any negotiation only succeeds if the parties themselves are willing and able to compromise. So I think this question of whether there's an outsider brought in at this point is truly exaggerated in its significance.
And in terms of the makeup of the talks, I mean, before Christmas it was just the DUP and Sinn Féin. Since Christmas, the smaller parties have had some limited engagement with the talks. How important is it, do you think, that everyone should be involved on almost an equal footing?
I think it's good that you bring in the smaller parties. I think this is not simply a two-party mechanism. But I'd also say, by the way, it shows to me a lack of urgency about standing up Stormont. It's been, what, a year now, 13 months since it operated. People have learned that the sun still rises in the east without it. And I think with Brexit and some of the other issues going on, there's a real lack of urgency about the immediate issues of these talks. And it's very hard to succeed in any negotiation, no matter how many parties, when there isn't urgency. And I think that's simply a fact of life here.
Do you have a view on the reimposition of direct rule?
Well, again, it seems to me it's undesirable, but you have elements of it in a halfway house or de facto. And I think this is just treading water. The real question is whether the people of Northern Ireland, and more important, their leaders, are going to be able to deal with the big issues of the past, and increasingly whether they're going to be able to deal with some of the issues of the present, Brexit and the like. So these narrower issues about Stormont and the rest, I think, are increasingly being superseded by the larger issues about basic relationships.
So if you were to be asked what your next step would be, Dr. Haass, what would you say?
Well, again, I would probably focus less on some of the immediate issues of dealing with Stormont, and I would go back to some of the basic issues, whether it is dealing with the past, which I believe still has and needs to be done to implement the Stormont agreement, and I would probably also talk about some of these larger issues surrounding the talks. That ultimately may be more important than whether the Parliament is in session or not.